Thomas Bennett stood in the doorway of his pristine home, briefcase in hand, watching a scene that made his heart catch in his throat. His 3-year-old daughter Emma was engaged in what could only be described as a gentle tug-of-war with a woman he'd just hired that morning. But both were smiling, actually smiling. The woman wore a simple blue dress with a white apron, her brown hair pulled back with a white headband. She had the kind of face that seemed naturally warm, with laugh lines around her eyes that suggested a life well lived. Her name was Margaret Hayes, and she was 58 years old. She'd been the last applicant Thomas interviewed, after 17 others had either quit or been let go. Margaret held one end of a jump rope while Emma, in her favorite pink dress with her blonde hair in pigtails, held the other. They weren't really pulling against each other, they were playing. And on Margaret's shoulders sat Emma's sister Lily, giggling with pure delight. Nearby, the third triplet, Sophie, was actually laughing. The sound was rusty, as if her small voice had forgotten how. Thomas felt his chest tighten. It had been 8 months since his wife Caroline died. 8 months of silence in a house that used to ring with joy. 8 months of watching his little girls withdraw into themselves, their bright spirits dimming a little more each day. He'd tried everything. Expensive toys they ignored. Elaborate playrooms they avoided. Nannies who came with impressive credentials but left within weeks, frustrated by 3 toddlers who wouldn't respond, wouldn't engage, wouldn't smile. Margaret had arrived that morning with a simple canvas bag and a gentle demeanor. She was a widow herself, she told him during the interview. Her husband had passed 5 years ago. She understood grief. She understood that sometimes the smallest gestures meant the most. "I don't have fancy degrees in child psychology," she'd said, her voice steady and kind. "But I raised 4 children of my own, and I've helped raise a dozen grandchildren. What I know is that hurting hearts need time, patience, and someone who won't push too hard." Thomas had hired her on the spot, something desperate in him responding to her quiet confidence. Now, watching her with his daughters, he understood why his instincts had been right. Margaret noticed him standing there. She gently lowered Lily from her shoulders and walked over, her movements unhurried. "Mr. Bennett," she said softly, "I hope you don't mind. We were just having a little fun before dinner." Thomas shook his head, unable to speak for a moment. "They're laughing," he finally managed. "Yes," Margaret said simply. "Children want to laugh, even when they're sad. Sometimes they just need permission." Over the following weeks, Thomas watched a transformation unfold in his home. Margaret didn't try to replace their mother. She spoke about Caroline openly, naturally. She'd found photographs and placed them where the girls could see them at their eye level. When Sophie asked one day where Mommy was, Margaret didn't offer complicated explanations. She simply said, "Your mommy loved you very much, and that love is still here. It's in every hug, every bedtime story, every time your daddy smiles at you." She established gentle routines. Breakfast at the kitchen table, not in front of tablets. Walks in the garden, where she taught them to look for ladybugs and listen to birds. Afternoon quiet time, where she'd read to them in her calm, measured voice, pausing to let them ask questions or point at pictures. Margaret baked cookies with the girls, letting them make messes and lick spoons. She sang old songs while helping them dress, her voice slightly off-key but full of warmth. She sat on the floor during playtime, her aging knees protesting but her spirit willing. One evening, Thomas came home to find Margaret teaching the triplets how to set the table. Emma was carefully placing napkins. Lily was counting forks. Sophie was arranging flowers in a small vase, the ones they'd picked from the garden. "We're making things beautiful," Sophie announced to her father. "Margaret says making things beautiful makes hearts feel better." Thomas looked at Margaret, who simply smiled. "Your wife had excellent taste," Margaret said later, after the girls were in bed. "I found her recipe book in the kitchen. There are notes in the margins, little messages to herself. The girls loved this one or Thomas's favorite. I thought perhaps we might try making some of those dishes, not to replace memories, but to honor them." Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. All the other nannies had wanted to establish new systems, new rules, knew everything. Margaret understood that what his family needed wasn't a fresh start. They needed continuity. They needed to feel Caroline's presence woven into their days, not erased from them. Margaret stayed for dinner that evening, at Thomas's insistence. She sat at the table, helping cut food into small pieces and wiping chins with practiced efficiency. But she also listened. When Emma told a rambling story about a butterfly she'd seen, Margaret gave it her full attention. When Lily asked why the moon followed them in the car, Margaret took the question seriously and explained it in simple terms. When Sophie grew quiet, Margaret didn't push. She just rested a gentle hand on the little girl's shoulder. After dinner, Thomas found himself talking with Margaret while the girls played nearby. For the first time in months, he spoke about Caroline, not the facts of her illness and death, which he'd recited numbly to doctors and lawyers and well-meaning relatives, but about who she was. Her love of terrible puns, her habit of singing in the shower, the way she'd insisted on reading the Triplets 3 stories every night, no matter how exhausted she was. "She sounds wonderful," Margaret said, and there was no awkwardness in her voice, no discomfort with death and grief. "The girls have her spirit. I can see it. Emma has her determination. Lily has her curiosity. And Sophie has her tenderness." "You see that?" Thomas asked, surprised. "Of course," Margaret said. "Love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It transforms. It lives on in the people left behind. Your daughters are walking proof of their mother's love." Winter turned to spring. The girls grew more animated, more engaged. They still had sad days, moments when they asked for mummy and dissolved into tears. But Margaret held them through those moments, never minimizing their pain but not letting it consume them either. "It's okay to miss her," she'd say. "Missing someone means they mattered. That's a beautiful thing, even though it hurts." Thomas found himself healing too. Margaret's presence in the home brought a different kind of comfort than Caroline's had, but comfort nonetheless. She made sure he ate properly. She listened when he needed to talk. She gave him space when he needed silence. She never overstepped, but she was always there. One afternoon, Thomas came home early to find a remarkable scene. Margaret had cleared furniture from the living room and spread blankets on the floor. The girls were having an indoor picnic, complete with sandwiches cut into shapes and juice in fancy cups. They were laughing, all three of them, their voices bright and clear. Margaret caught his eye and smiled. In her blue dress and white apron, sitting on the floor with his daughters, she looked like something from another era. A simpler time, perhaps. A gentler one. "We're celebrating," Emma announced. "Margaret says every day should have something special in it." "And what makes today special?" Thomas asked, sitting down to join them. "We're all together," Sophie said, as if this were obvious. Later, after the girls were asleep, Thomas and Margaret sat in the kitchen drinking tea. "I don't know how to thank you," Thomas said. "When you arrived, I was drowning. I didn't know how to reach my own children. They were slipping away from me, into their grief, and I couldn't follow. I couldn't help them." Margaret shook her head gently. "You were grieving too. That's not weakness. That's love. You just needed someone to help carry the weight for a while." "It's more than that," Thomas insisted. "You've given them something I couldn't. Joy, hope, the ability to be children again." "I've given them time and patience," Margaret corrected. "The joy was always in them. It just needed coaxing out, like bulbs in winter, waiting for spring." Thomas smiled at the metaphor. It was so perfectly Margaret, finding the simple poetry in everyday truth. "My own children worried when I took this position," Margaret said quietly. "They thought I was too old, that 3 toddlers would be too much. But I told them this is what my heart needed. After my husband died, I felt purposeless for a while. Then I realized that grief had taught me something valuable. It taught me how to sit with pain without trying to fix it immediately. How to let people feel what they need to feel. How to be present without being intrusive." "You've been a gift," Thomas said, "to all of us." As months passed, the Bennett household settled into a rhythm that felt, if not normal, then at least peaceful. The girls started preschool, and Margaret was there every morning, helping with backpacks and offering encouragement. She was there every afternoon, ready with snacks and questions about their day. She was there for scraped knees and hurt feelings, for triumphs and setbacks. And gradually, quietly, Thomas realized something. His home felt like a home again. Not the same as before, perhaps. Caroline's absence would always be felt. But the house was no longer a mausoleum of grief. It was a place where children laughed, where people gathered, where life continued. One evening, almost a year after Margaret had arrived, Thomas found her in the garden with the girls. They were releasing fireflies they'd caught in jars, watching them light up the dusk. "Make a wish," Margaret told each girl as they opened their jars. "I wish Mommy could see this," Sophie whispered. Margaret knelt beside her, her aging knees protesting. "I think she can, sweetheart. I think wherever people we love go, they can still see the beautiful things their loved ones do. And this is very beautiful." Thomas stood watching them, silhouetted against the deepening sky. An older woman in a blue dress and white apron, grey touching her brown hair. 3 small girls in matching pink dresses, blonde pigtails catching the last light. All of them releasing fireflies into the warm evening air, tiny stars rising into the darkness. It was a small moment, a quiet one. But it held within it everything that mattered: presence, gentleness. The patient work of helping broken hearts learn to beat with joy again. Margaret looked up and saw him standing there. She smiled. And in that smile was understanding. An acknowledgement that healing isn't a destination but a journey. That grief and joy can coexist. That sometimes the greatest kindness is simply showing up, day after day, with patience and love. The fireflies rose higher, their lights blinking in the darkness. And in the Bennett home, for the first time in a long time, there was laughter echoing into the night.